Hello, welcome to another episode of No Free Lunch, Economics for a Fallen World. I'm Dr. Jeff Guernsey, joined by Dr. Jeff Heyman. So Dr. Heyman, in prior episodes we've talked about supply, but I think you want to talk about production this time. What is it?
Well, production is the very process of taking one set of inputs and making a set of output. It's as simple as that. I mean, whether we were trying to construct a deck on our backyard, of taking some wood you buy down at Home Depot or Lowe's and some hammer and nails, and pretty soon at the end of the day, if you're like me, you have a mess. But if you're like you, Dr. Guernsey, I'm sure it would be a beautiful deck, and that would be a productive output using productive inputs. So that's the basic process of production. Every entrepreneur has to come up with the use of resources, land, labor, capital, and mix that with their entrepreneurship. And with that, if they do it well, they'll come up with an output. And if the value of the output is worth more than the cost of all those inputs, well, then the entrepreneur makes profit, and that's a good thing.
So there's a structure of production. Talk about that.
Yeah, the structure of production is really important because we have a lot of discussion in our economy, certainly in our public policy about the economy, in terms of, if it's slack, for instance, we may need to stimulate the consumer, but we really need to understand the economy is not simply those final retail sales. And in the book, we've got a couple charts that illustrate, and we'll show a couple of those here for us to look at. So I've got a couple things here to think about it. You might think of this wonderful castle that's kind of developed. This is a picture in the book of an implication of what could be a replication of the temple that we had described in the Bible. Well, that clearly has some wood and beams that would be associated with it, and there's some rock. And notice that these beams are kind of already structured. They're finished, and I'm not the woodworker, but you can clearly see that they've been through some process at the mill to make it. But they start out with raw logs that would have been there, and then you might have gotten these rocks out of a quarry, and these are rocks at a beach. And oh, by the way, to get to these logs cut, you have to have saws, and you have to have axes and so forth. There's a whole series of things that have to happen before you ever get to this final product. And that big overarching process we would call the structure of production. And so we would call the final consumer goods, the output of that would be goods of the first order. And then we'd have goods of the second order and goods of the third order, and we call these higher order goods. And here's what's interesting about this structure of production is the bulk of our economy is really in these time upstream parts of the process before we ever get to the end result. So if we're trying to stimulate the economy, we have to stimulate the economy across time at a moment in time. So there's activities right now that might not bear fruit for months from now, but that's economic activity that happens as well today. So understanding that the economy is not all just at one fixed spot in time is kind of important, and economists call this a structure of production. And it really refers mainly to capital goods. We have a second chart that people might be familiar with as well. It may make more sense, I don't know. You might think of it as, okay, raw materials are used at that very initial part of the production process. And that might add a little bit of value or cost to the output product. Then we might take those and manufacture those raw materials into a product. That adds more value. And then we could send it off to wholesalers. And then it finally go to Walmart, our retail trade, or wherever you buy, Amazon. And you see that each step of the way takes time, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship acting in time, and we get more value added at each stop of the production process until we finally get to this output, which are the retail sales. And just because we pay the full finished price doesn't mean that the vast bulk of that economic activity in value terms happened prior to that temporally.
So that sounds fairly complex. I mean, there's a lot of players involved and so forth. How does the market determine this structure?
Woohoo, that's a big question, and I'm glad you asked. To try and just simplify it as much as I can, it is complex. It has to fit together in a way that the time sequence all works out. And the way the market coordinates all this is the same way it coordinates everything else, through the pricing mechanism. That will be the prices of what we call those higher order capital goods. So if we go back, the price of this output versus this at different levels, that's part of this. Also, interest rates play a big part of that as well. If the interest rate is lower, it might stimulate production further away. If interest rates are higher, you might have different values for something that would be closer to the production process. So that weighs in as well. And so the important part of the structure of production, when we think about the economy, we've got to have all of that work together well. And anything that gets in the way of the market being able to price those various assets correctly according to true consumer desires, and not necessarily opposed as the way some politician might want it, lends to a better, more smoothly organized production. And likewise, that would ensure that we have supply equaling demand. Because we're familiar from the previous chapters, as you recall, with supply equaling demand at a moment in time. This is trying to ensure we have supply equaling demand across time. And that's where the structure of production weighs in.
I think that's really helpful to think of. There's multiple markets represented
Yes.
on that chart, aren't there? Not just the
Oh.
final good for consumption or, in this case,
Yeah, pick
enjoyment,
that
I
up because
suppose.
you're on track. I'm going to let you run with that. What else would you say? I mean, you've got wood there. Does it
Well,
just go to the El Escorital or
No,
whatever?
it could be used for multiple other purposes,
Yeah,
right? So there would be a demand for that type of wood that might be used multiple places and so forth.
Absolutely right. There's a whole spider web of relationships you could have between these output products. And all those have to be coordinated, and all of them are bidding for the use of these resources. And the consumer ultimately will determine what they are produced with and for according to the values they place on it.
And it's quite remarkable that happens
Yes.
spontaneously or organically.
Organically,
Yeah,
yes.
great. Fantastic. All right, well, thank you for joining us for this episode of No Free Lunch, Economics for a Fallen World.